For many families in El Salvador, every penny counts. When Enkela lost her job at the clothing factory, everything fell apart. She began working at age 10 to help her parents and 3 siblings meet their basic needs. Now, she could no longer help provide for them and her 3-year-old daughter. The only other jobs she qualified for were life-threatening. But then she remembered her neighbor, Areli, a single mother who also had no other options until she found work in the United States, the home of opportunity. Enkela reached out to Areli, who lives in a small town in Nebraska. She explained to Enkela the struggle she will have to overcome: language, cultural and financial barriers, limited access to health care and benefits, and long work hours. But at least there was work. Her lonesome journey began on a hot summer day climbing La Bestia, or the Beast, cargo trains that cross multiple countries to the U.S. With her last bit of money, she paid a coyote, a smuggler, to help her and other poor migrants get to the United States. In Nebraska, Areli connected Enkela to her employer, a cleaning service. Areli was staying with multiple roommates, most of whom were migrants also. With only the clothes on her back, Enkela began cleaning homes for less than minimum wage, but it was never enough. Enkela cleaned homes in the day and businesses at night, 65, 70 hours a week. It was only a matter of time before Enkela became physically and psychologically exhausted. After a few months, Enkela saved up for a cheap car. Because she was undocumented in Nebraska, Enkela could not obtain a driver's license and was charged a higher rate for car insurance. With the hours she saved walking home, she ended up working them to afford her new expenses. Years passed since Enkela had seen her daughter. Despite everything she was going through, Enkela found love at the most unexpected moment in her life. Joel was also undocumented and struggled in the same ways she had. They found a home together just in time for their son to be born. Enkela is one of the many undocumented immigrants living in the U.S. with limited to zero immigration relief available.
There are an estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. today.
Can an undocumented immigrant become legal resident of the United States of America? What are the options of an undocumented immigrant?
That's a big "it depends" question, right? There are limited pathways to citizenship, so it depends on whether an individual might qualify. And you might qualify for some sort of family-based type of relief. Now, if you entered the United States without a visa, you would be required to exit the country, spend some time outside of the United States, perhaps depending upon how much time you've spent inside the United States. So it wouldn't be just an application and a green card immediately if you entered without inspection and without a visa.
Okay. There could be an employment-based option where an employer petitions for that individual to obtain lawful status. However, the fact that they entered unlawfully will require them to exit the country, and upon exiting, there could be a number of different bars that could operate to require them to remain outside the country for a certain period of time and then request a waiver to re-enter. There also are some consequences of certain conduct in the United States, for example, having worked using the identity of a United States citizen. That's considered a false claim to U.S. citizenship, and that constitutes a bar that is not waivable. If somebody is in the U.S. undocumented, they could affirmatively apply for a certain type of humanitarian benefit, such as asylum, if they have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home country. If they've been the victim of certain crimes within the United States, they might be able to apply for something called a U visa. They also, if they come into contact with immigration enforcement, could be placed in removal or deportation proceedings before an immigration judge. And at that point, they may have the opportunity, if they qualify, to apply for asylum defensively before the immigration court, or may have a variety of other options. There's a common type of benefit called cancellation of removal, which is available to individuals who have been in the United States physically present for 10 years and have close family members, citizen or lawful permanent resident spouses, children or parents.
Yeah, so what that response sort of illuminates is that it's really complex, right? The system is really complex and the type of relief that is available is really complex. So what's most important is consultation with Immigration Legal Counsel.
Can you tell me a little bit about being undocumented with no option in the United States? What happens to me? What is my future? Because to me, even a traffic stop may turn to be the end of my journey in the United States if I'm staying undocumented in the United States.
We frequently consult with individuals who do not have any immigration option. None of the things I mentioned previously are available based on their history or lack of relationships or their particular facts and circumstances. In the state of Nebraska, in our jurisdiction, that means that they lack access to a driver's license. Throughout the country, that means they do not have access to a social security number. If they previously had documentation and have fallen out of status, say they entered on a visa and were authorized to work under that visa, they may have obtained a social security number at that time, and then their period of authorized stay expired. And so there is also a group of undocumented individuals who entered lawfully, right, but have fallen out of status. But in general, those who entered without inspection and have never had employment authorization will not have access to a social security number, which means they're not work authorized, cannot obtain a driver's license, cannot obtain any sort of public benefit. Their U.S. citizen children, if they are born in the United States and citizens by virtue of birth in the United States, are entitled to public benefits like any other U.S. citizen.
So a
But not
traffic
the parents,
offense,
right?
what
Yes.
does that mean,
Yes.
right? So it really varies by jurisdiction. And when I say by jurisdiction, it doesn't just mean from state to state, right? It can vary just in the state of Nebraska by county, right? And how it's enforced by local law enforcement and local policies. Generally, though, in the state of Nebraska, driving without a license, you don't have access to a driver's license, Anna mentioned. If you're arrested you can be arrested for driving without a license in the state of Nebraska. It's an arrestable offense. In the event an individual is arrested for driving without a license, they're placed in jail and would be subject to a fine that would have to be paid before release from jail. What could happen to someone who's undocumented could be perhaps, maybe local law enforcement asks question to elicit information about country of nationality. If that happens and someone doesn't exercise their right to remain silent, right, then what local law enforcement could do, but may not necessarily do, is contact ICE to see if ICE would like to put an ICE hold on this individual that's been detained by local law enforcement for a traffic offense.
And this depends on the jurisdiction, you said?
It can depend on the officer.
On the officer?
Yeah, yeah. So now there are some jurisdictions across the country where the local jails have entered into what's called 287G agreements, where local law enforcement are deputized to act as ICE officers. So when that happens, a local jailer could literally place someone in removal proceedings, place someone in deportation proceedings by serving them with a piece of paper that says, you have a hearing.
I am the undocumented immigrant. What comes next?
So if ICE requests that the county jail hold the undocumented immigrant, that hold, assuming the county jail honors it, will be in place for 48 hours and will afford ICE 48 hours after the time the person otherwise would have been released to take custody over the person, right? And taking custody may be no more than a matter of paperwork. The person may not physically be moved. Throughout Nebraska and Iowa, there are county jails that have contracts with ICE to detain immigration detainees in the county jail bed space. So ICE pays the county jail for a certain amount of bed space. So the individual may be transferred legally and technically from criminal custody or state custody, right, in the county jail, to ICE custody, but they may never physically move locations.
They're in the same building, yes.
Right.
And before we move to the length, the time of detention, I would like to understand one thing. If I live, let's say, in Colorado, but I am stopped in Nebraska, which jurisdiction applies to me?
The enforcement policies and practices of the jurisdiction where you are encountered, apprehended, would apply. So
Okay.
the policy of Nebraska.
Of Nebraska, since we're in
jurisdictions.
Nebraska.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about the detention length. What does the law say? How long should that detention period be?
An individual who is detained in immigration custody may be in a variety of different legal scenarios, right? They could be detained because they are subject to mandatory detention under the Immigration and Nationality Act because of a criminal offense. They could be offered a bond by ICE but unable to pay that bond. They could also be subject to detention because they are what's called an arriving alien. They are seeking asylum. There's a provision under which those individuals have to remain detained throughout their proceeding unless ICE elects to release them. Generally, if someone is required to remain detained because they're subject to mandatory detention or cannot post their bond, they will remain detained throughout the duration of their removal proceedings. And if those are removal proceedings in immigration court, that's likely to be several months.
Several months.
Particularly if they're in removal proceedings in the interior of the country. Removal proceedings at the border tend to move more quickly. But several months just for the initial removal proceedings before the immigration judge and a decision on any relief application they may have filed. From there, they may have the right to appeal the immigration judge's decision to an appellate body called the Board of Immigration Appeals. If they do that, that likely would take another 4 to 9 months, I would say, to get a decision from the board, and then if the board agrees that the immigration judge made a mistake, the case would be remanded to the immigration judge, and could be several months more for the judge to hear that case again. There's also another appellate level. If the board again denies, they could appeal to the circuit court, the federal circuit court, in which the case arises. So here in Nebraska, that would be the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. If that happens, that's another 9 months, perhaps. So somebody who is required to remain detained throughout removal proceedings and any appeals could potentially be in detention for several years.
Several years.
Yes.
And those are cases in which someone is not subject to expedited removal. Expedited removal is when someone is removed expeditiously. You're deported really, really quickly, and certain individuals may be subject to expedited removal, and because of that, again, it's really important to, in the event someone is detained, to try to get immediate access to counsel. So Anna talked about perhaps it happening quickly if someone's closer to the border. By quickly, it could happen within 24 to 48 hours, right? That's really, really quick in terms of access to legal counsel.
Okay. And who could be a candidate for an expedited removal? If we can, not to talk about the concept, just can you give us an example?
Sure. One example might be someone who has been in the United States for less than 2 years and is within 100 miles of the border, right? Like the edge of the United States. Another example might be someone who has a prior removal order.
Okay. Let's say that person is not lucky and unfortunately has to be deported. What exactly happened in deportation? I understand the word and I can picture the process, but if you can tell me what happens to a person that today I am at court or the decision is made, the verdict came, you have to be removed you will be deported to your country. What happens to me?
If the individual is being removed through an expedited removal process, that is executed exclusively by ICE. The immigration judge, who's within the Department of Justice, is not involved in that. So there's just an administrative removal order issued by ICE. And that deportation, as Dearra mentioned, typically happens along the border. And so there can be a very quick physical removal, physical deportation. If the individual is a national of Mexico, typically that deportation is by bus. Or if they're apprehended immediately at the border, they may physically be turned around and walked back across the border on foot. If someone is apprehended and goes through removal proceedings in the interior of the U.S., they will typically be deported by bus to Mexico or to Canada, I suppose. And if they are a national of another country, say Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, a country that's not contiguous with the United States, they will be physically deported through a chartered flight. And those typically depart on a designated day of the week. They wait until the flight is fairly full. U.S. Marshals, it's my understanding, U.S. Marshals escort the deportees on that flight. The flights typically go to the largest airport in the home country, often the country of deportation, often the capital city. Whether the deportation is by bus to Mexico or by flight, there is no consideration, no accommodation made for returning somebody to their home region. They're attractive targets for crime and particularly for kidnapping and extortion, because criminal organizations assume that they have relatives in the United States who might be willing to pay or able to pay a ransom. Yeah.
Do we know how much it costs a taxpayer to detain a person, to stop a person, detain that person, and then deport that individual to their home country?
Detention is different than deportation too, because when you think about deportation, you think about a bus ride, right? Maybe a meal along the way or a flight. When we think about detention, we have to think about beds, about salaries of people who are jailers, right? Like working in the jail, meals during that time. And it might be an individual who, like we talked about earlier, has been arrested for driving without a license and has lived in the United States for decades and has no traffic citations or criminal convictions or any other interaction with law enforcement.
And I think in addition to the direct costs to taxpayers of detention and deportation, there are also sort of extenuated costs, right? The individuals who are detained for perhaps 2 years while their removal proceedings are ongoing were previously often productive members of society, right?
And contributing to the
who
economy.
were contributing productively to the economy.
Because you do pay taxes, right?
Property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And in your opinion, you're both attorneys, if you had to change something in today's law, what would that be?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is caps with respect to family-based immigration. So I talked about certain categories of relatives where it may take a really, really long time for a relative to join in the United States. And I'll give you an example. So if I'm a United States citizen and I'm 21 years old and I want to bring my brother to the United States, he's a national of Mexico. For a visa to become available to him, because of the caps on countries, like per country limit, and the caps on categories of relatives, it would take an excess of 160 years for my brother to join me in the United States. When we give educational presentations and we talk to individuals about, who do you consider your immediate relative, right? Who are people you're closest to in your family? You might hear a grandparent talk about their grandchild, right? Or you might hear someone talking about a sibling or an aunt or a cousin, and some of those categories don't exist. A grandparent cannot petition for their grandchild to come to the United States. So caps and categories of relatives, I think, are things that I would change.
Okay. How about you, Anna?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the biggest thing in my mind is some sort of pathway to citizenship for individuals who have been living in the United States for an extended period of time, often decades, have very close family ties here, typically have multiple U.S. citizen children, but also siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, are full participants and bring a wealth of assets to our communities and our economies, and are really fully integrated into the fabric of our society. It's a no-brainer in my mind that the longtime residents who are part of the fabric of our society should be able to move toward citizenship and have the full rights and privileges of the rest of us.
They're Americans in every other sense of the word, right?
But not in
But documentation.
Yeah. And nowadays, I read a lot, I see a lot about the separation of families and children at the point of entry at the border. Can you please tell me, where does it fit in all this scheme that you just described here? You know, the arrest, the detention, the deportation. Where does the separation of children and parents happen?
Kind of occur at the border, like you talked about. Separating a father from his children and detaining that family separately could happen. But it also can happen when someone goes through the process we just talked about, right? Where a family member could be separated as a result of participating in the immigration legal process. It's also just a part of the immigration legal system. So you asked earlier about different pathways to relief, and the limited pathways of relief create family separation as well. We talked a little bit about family-based forms of relief. And while there are family-based forms of relief, there are limited categories of family members who can join their relatives, their U.S. citizen relatives within the United States. And the timeline can be really, really long, longer than a lifetime, depending upon the category of the relative and the availability of a visa.
Okay, how about we imagine we're at the border and we see the families that are separated. First of all, why are they separated, children from their families, from their parents? Does the law provision this? Why does this happen?
Most recently, and the most official policy change that resulted in family separation was the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy that formally, technically, was only in place from like April to June of 2018. And that was a policy under which anyone who entered the U.S. irregularly or outside of or between a port of entry was prosecuted for the federal offense of illegal entry or illegal re-entry if it had been a second or subsequent entry. In order to prosecute individuals for that crime, they were separated from any children they may have been traveling with, put in U.S. Marshal custody, and rooted through the criminal processing. The children cannot be detained in federal criminal custody and were not being charged with that federal crime, and so that functioned to separate the parents who were being prosecuted from the children who were placed in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is the agency, the sub-agency of the Department of Health and Human Services that has responsibility for the care and custody of unaccompanied minors, so children who present themselves or who are apprehended at the border who are under 18 and not in the custody of a parent or guardian. And the crazy thing about the zero tolerance and family separation is that the administration apparently made very few provisions, very minimal efforts to develop a plan for reunification, for tracking these parents and these children as they moved up through these separate systems and assuring that they could be reconnected and reunified.
Yeah, that was my next question. How long does it take, if you have that information, for a family to reunite with mom and dad, a kid?
You have to find them first, right? And if the government's not tracking it and the parents aren't privy to that information, then the timeline could be rather long.
So there was a court order, I believe it was June 2018, requiring the administration to reunite parents and children that were separated under this policy. And it's my understanding that there are still a certain number of those children who fell under the jurisdiction of that order who have not been reunited with family, either because their parents were physically removed, sometimes under pressure from ICE officers who were telling them the only way you'll be able to be reunited with your child is if you take this removal order. So now mom or dad is back in Guatemala, child is here, still in the custody of ORR, or perhaps now in a foster placement through ORR. Or a variety of situations that they've not been able to reconnect parent and child. There are also apparently a number of parents and children or guardians and children who were separated prior to the official policy being announced and in place, and since. The administration has continued to do it in sort of an ad hoc way where they feel there's some justification for separation. So it's not over, and it's apparently continuing to happen, and even the kids who did fall under that order have not necessarily been reunited.
Think about someone, though, who's in jail and they're transported from one jail to the other, and we track their personal belongings, right?
Yeah.
Their jeans that they wore that day, tennis shoes,
we don't
but
track.
someone's children?
Yeah.
This was America with an Accent for this week. Next episode will be in the format of a debate on what needs to be reformed in today's immigration law. I hope to see you again here on KPAO or online at www.newamericansmedia.com. I am Enkela Vehbiu.